If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Because tonight's story isn't about something hiding under your bed, it's about something far worse, something inside a man's home that has been living his life when he's not looking. His name was Arthur Vance, a retired structural engineer who spent most of his life believing in one simple truth: that everything in this world could be explained with logic. For over 40 years, Arthur made sure bridges didn't collapse, buildings didn't lean, and every calculation had a precise answer. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in the supernatural, and he certainly wasn't someone who scared easily. But many years ago, in the autumn, Arthur began to notice something that couldn't be explained by numbers, formulas, or any law of physics he had ever trusted. Something was happening inside his home. Arthur lived in a beautiful, albeit drafty, Victorian house built decades ago. It was a house with good bones, as he liked to say. He lived there alone, following the passing of his wife Martha years ago. His routine was as rigid as a steel beam. He woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, brewed a pot of black coffee, read the newspaper on his porch, and spent his afternoons woodworking in the basement. By 9 o'clock in the evening, he was in bed. It was a quiet life, a predictable life, until the Tuesday of the second week of October. It started with a coffee mug. Arthur had a favorite mug, a heavy ceramic thing with a chip on the rim that he'd had for as long as he could remember. He specifically remembered placing it in the dishwasher before going to bed. But when he walked into the kitchen at 6 o'clock the next morning, the mug wasn't in the dishwasher. It was sitting on the center of the dining room table, half filled with lukewarm coffee. Not just coffee, but coffee with cream and 2 sugars. Arthur hadn't taken cream or sugar in his coffee since he was diagnosed with borderline diabetes years ago. He stood there, staring at the mug, his logical brain searching for a file that explained this. Did he sleepwalk? He had never sleepwalked in his entire life. Did a neighbor have a key? No, he had changed the locks just 3 months prior. He eventually poured the coffee down the sink, washed the mug, and told himself he was simply getting older. Forgetfulness, he reasoned, was the one structural flaw he couldn't engineer his way out of. But then, the incidents began to escalate in a way that felt less like forgetfulness and more like something was taking over his reality piece by piece. 3 days later, Arthur returned from a trip to the grocery store at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. As he stepped through the front door, the house felt occupied. There was a lingering scent in the air. It wasn't the smell of his cedarwood aftershave or the scent of old books. It was the smell of frying bacon and expensive perfume. Specifically, the perfume Martha used to wear a French brand called Evening in Paris that had been discontinued years ago. Heart hammering against his ribs, Arthur dropped his groceries and ran into the kitchen. The stove was off, the counters were clean. But when he touched the cast iron skillet sitting on the back burner, it was scorching hot. He looked into the trash can and saw the wrappers for a package of thick-cut bacon. Bacon he had not bought. Bacon that wasn't on his receipt. "Is someone here?" he shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed a heavy rolling pin from the counter and began a room-by-room search of the 3-story house. He checked the closets, the space behind the heavy velvet curtains, and even the cramped crawl space in the attic. Nothing. The house was sealed tight, all the windows were locked from the inside. The deadbolt was engaged. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat in his wingback chair in the living room with a flashlight and a heavy iron fire poker. He waited. He watched the shadows stretch across the 1920s wallpaper. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the witching hour, he drifted off into a light, uneasy doze. He woke up 30 minutes later to a sound that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. It was the sound of humming. It was coming from the floor directly above him, the master bedroom. It was a soft, melodic humming of a song from the 1950s, a tune called Unforgettable. It was the song he and Martha had danced to at their wedding in 1976. Arthur bolted up the stairs, 3 steps at a time, ignoring the protest of his aging knees. He slammed the bedroom door open and clicked on the light. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, just as he had left it, but as he stood there, gasping for breath, he noticed something on the nightstand. There was a pair of reading glasses sitting there. Gold-rimmed, delicate, Arthur reached out a trembling hand and picked them up. He felt a jolt of pure ice run down his spine. These weren't his glasses, they were Martha's. He had buried Martha with her glasses 6 years ago, or at least he thought he had. He ran to the hallway closet where he kept her old belongings. The box labeled "Personal Effects" was sitting on the floor, its tape ripped open. Inside, her clothes, dresses she hadn't worn in decades, were neatly folded, but they felt warm to the touch, as if they had just been pressed with a hot iron. At this point, Arthur was convinced he was either losing his mind or something was very wrong. But the Mr. Ballen fans among you know that ghosts usually don't leave physical evidence behind, like bacon wrappers and lukewarm coffee. This was something else. This was a glitch. This was a defiance of logic. The next morning, Arthur decided to play detective. He went to the local hardware store and bought 3 high-end motion-activated cameras. He told the clerk, a young man in his early 20s, that he was worried about raccoons in the attic. But Arthur wasn't looking for raccoons, he was looking for himself, or whatever was pretending to be him. He installed 1 camera in the kitchen, 1 in the hallway, and 1 in the master bedroom. He linked them to his smartphone, a piece of technology he usually loathed, but now viewed as his only link to sanity. That evening, he did something radical. He left. He drove his old Buick LeSabre to a motel 10 miles away, checked into a room, and sat on the edge of the bed with his phone in his hand. For the first 4 hours, nothing happened. The black and white feed showed his empty, silent house. Then, at exactly 11 o'clock in the evening, the notification on his phone chirped. Motion detected in kitchen. Arthur's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the phone. He tapped the app and opened the live feed. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the faint green glow of the microwave clock. Then, the back door, the door Arthur had personally double-locked and barred, with a piece of timber swung open smoothly. A figure walked in. It was a man. He was wearing a flannel shirt and khaki trousers. He moved with a familiar gait, a slight limp in the right leg from a construction accident in 1992. The man walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and took out a carton of eggs. He hummed unforgettable under his breath. Arthur felt the world tilt beneath him. The man on the screen was him. It was Arthur Vance. But it wasn't the Arthur Vance sitting in a motel room. This Arthur looked younger, maybe in his early 50s. His hair was more salt than pepper. He looked almost happy. Too happy. Then another figure entered the frame. Arthur's heart stopped. It was Martha. She looked exactly as she did on their 25th wedding anniversary. She walked up to the other Arthur, wrapped her arms around his waist, and kissed his shoulder. "Did you get the structural reports finished, Artie?" she asked. Her voice was crystal clear through the camera's microphone. "Almost, honey," the other Arthur replied. "Just need to finish the calculations for the bridge project tomorrow." Arthur stared at the screen in a trance of horror and longing. They were talking about a project he had finished in 2004. They were living a Tuesday night from 20 years ago, but they were doing it in his house, in the year 2026. He watched as they cooked an omelet together. He watched as they laughed about a neighbor's dog. It was a perfect, ordinary moment from a life that no longer existed. But then, things took a dark turn. The other Arthur suddenly stopped laughing. He turned his head and looked directly at the hidden camera perched atop the kitchen cabinet. His eyes, which should have been brown, were a flat, matte black. No iris, no pupil, just 2 holes of infinite darkness. He walked toward the camera, his face growing larger and more distorted on the screen. He leaned in until his nose was almost touching the lens. "Arthur," the figure whispered. "You're staying in the wrong room. You're occupying the space where our memories are supposed to breathe. It's time to move out of the way." The screen went black. The app displayed a connection lost error message. Arthur didn't wait. He sprinted to his car and drove back to his house at 80 miles per hour. He didn't care about police. He didn't care about safety. He needed to know if his life had been stolen. When he arrived, the house was dark. The Buick was the only car in the driveway. He burst through the front door, shouting Martha's name. The house was cold. The smell of bacon and perfume was gone, replaced by the damp, musty smell of an old building in autumn. He ran to the kitchen. The eggs were still in the refrigerator. The skillet was cold. He checked the cameras. All 3 cameras had been ripped from their mounts and placed in a neat row on the dining room table. Their memory cards were missing. Arthur sat down at the table and buried his face in his hands. He stayed that way for hours, listening to the house settle. But as the sun began to peek over the Atlantic horizon, he heard a sound that chilled him to his marrow. It was the unmistakable sound of a typewriter. Arthur's office was on the 2nd floor. He hadn't used a typewriter since 1995 when he finally switched to a computer. He walked up the stairs, his movements robotic, fueled by a mixture of terror and a strange, desperate curiosity. He opened the door to his office. There, sitting on his mahogany desk, was his old Smith Corona typewriter. A single sheet of paper was tucked into the roller. Arthur walked over and read the lines typed on the page. October 12th, 1998. Today, Arthur realized that the house is getting smaller. Or perhaps he is getting larger. He keeps feeling like someone is watching him from the future. A man with gray hair and sad eyes. Martha says it's just the stress of the bridge project, but I know better. I can feel him breathing in my lungs. I can feel him looking through my mirrors. He is a ghost of a life I haven't lived yet, and I want him gone. The realization hit Arthur like a physical blow. He wasn't being haunted by the past. The past was being haunted by him. The glitch wasn't just in his house, it was in the fabric of time itself. 2 versions of the same life were trying to occupy the same square footage of reality, and according to the laws of physics, the laws Arthur had worshipped his entire career, 2 objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. One of them has to give way. Arthur looked into the office mirror. For a split second, he didn't see his own 64-year-old reflection. He saw the office as it looked in 1998. He saw a younger version of himself sitting at the desk, looking back with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. The younger Arthur picked up a heavy glass paperweight and hurled it at the mirror. The mirror in Arthur's 2026 reality shattered. Shards of glass flew across the room, cutting Arthur's cheek. He fell backward, gasping. When he looked up, the office was back to its modern state, empty, dusty, and silent. But the cut on his cheek was real. He touched the blood, bright red, warm, and pulsing. From that day forward, Arthur Vance was a changed man. He stopped trying to find a logical explanation. He stopped checking the cameras. He realized that the something living in his home wasn't an intruder. It was the current of his own existence, flowing backward and forward, creating eddies and whirlpools where they shouldn't be. He began to leave notes. He would type a message on the Smith Corona. Martha is allergic to the new detergent. Don't use it. Or the structural supports on the eastern span of the bridge need a second look. Sometimes he would get a response. He would find a note tucked under his pillow in the morning. Who are you? Why do you know these things? Leave us alone. The older Arthur grew, the more the house seemed to revert. The modern appliances began to fail, his smartphone stopped charging, the internet connection vanished. He found himself living in a house that was slowly being rewritten into the 1990s. One morning, he woke up, and his flat-screen television was gone, replaced by a heavy, wood-paneled floor model TV. His microwave was replaced by an early model Amana Radarange. Arthur Vance didn't fight it. He was tired of being a man of 64 in a world that felt increasingly alien. He missed Martha. He missed the certainty of his middle age. On a cold November night, Arthur lay down in his bed. He smelled the evening in Paris perfume. It was strong now, overwhelming. He felt a hand touch his forehead, a soft, familiar hand. "It's okay, Artie," a voice whispered. "The bridge is finished. You can come back now." Arthur closed his eyes. He felt a strange sensation, like he was being pulled through a very narrow straw. His bones ached, then felt light. His breath came easy. The weight of years of grief and decades of aging simply disappeared. The next morning, a neighbor named Mrs. Gable noticed that Arthur Vance's 1998 Buick was gone from the driveway. She knocked on the door to check on him, but no one answered. She called the police, not 911, but the non-emergency line, as she didn't want to cause a scene. When the officers entered the house, they found it completely empty. Not empty as in Arthur was gone, but empty as in no one had lived there for decades. The furniture was covered in thick layers of dust and white sheets. The air was stale and cold. There was no food in the refrigerator, no coffee in the pot. But when they reached the upstairs office, they found one thing that defied logic. On the desk sat an old Smith Corona typewriter. There was a piece of paper in the roller. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been typed moments ago. It read, "I am finally home. We are having bacon for breakfast." It is October 12th, 1998, and everything is exactly where it is supposed to be. The police checked the records. Arthur Vance had indeed lived in that house. But according to the town's archives, the house had been boarded up and abandoned since the year 2004, following a tragic fire that claimed the lives of Arthur Vance and his wife, Martha. The investigators looked at the abandoned kitchen. In the center of the dust-covered dining room table, there was a single clean spot. And sitting in that spot was a ceramic mug with a chip on the rim. It was half filled with lukewarm coffee, with cream and 2 sugars. And then everything stopped. The house still stands on that quiet coastal road, empty, boarded up, forgotten. No one lives there. And yet, some nights, when the fog rolls in, people say they can hear something inside, a faint clicking sound like a typewriter. And if you listen closely, you might hear a man humming. Unforgettable. But the house is empty, isn't it? At 3:15 in the morning, the camera caught something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't a stranger, it was him. If you're a fan of the strange, the dark, and the mysterious, then you're in the right place. This story begins on a quiet Tuesday night when a man heard a sound inside his wall that should not have been there. And by the time he followed it, he realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the wall. It was coming from somewhere much closer. Arthur Miller was a man of habit. Ever since his wife Martha passed away 5 years ago, he has lived a solitary life. He spent his time tinkering in his basement workshop, reading historical biographies, and dealing with the standard indignities of being nearly 60. He had a persistent ache in his lower back from 30 years of leaning over blueprints. His eyesight was fading to the point where he needed 3 different pairs of glasses, and he often forgot where he left his car keys. He was, by all accounts, a normal man, aging in a normal way. The strange occurrences began on a Thursday in late October. Arthur had woken up at 6:30 in the morning, just as he always did. He shuffled into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee, but when he reached for the cabinet where he kept the coffee beans, he found that the beans had already been ground and placed into the filter. The water reservoir was full. All he had to do was press start. Arthur paused, his hand hovering over the machine. He lived alone. He did not remember doing this the night before. In fact, he distinctly remembered finishing the last of the ground coffee and thinking he needed to use the grinder in the morning. He chalked it up to a senior moment, a phrase he used more and more lately to dismiss the little gaps in his memory. He pressed the button, the machine hissed to life, and he went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. When he looked into the mirror, something felt off. It was not a jump scare moment. There was no monster behind him. It was just his own face. But as he stood there, drying his face with a towel, he noticed that the heavy, dark circles under his eyes, the ones he'd had for a decade, seemed a little lighter. He leaned in, squinting. His skin looked tighter, healthier. He figured it was the lighting, or perhaps he had just slept particularly well. As the days progressed, these little improvements became more frequent and more impossible. One morning, Arthur woke up and realized the persistent, gnawing pain in his lumbar spine, the pain that had required him to take 4 ibuprofen every single morning just to get out of bed, was gone. It wasn't just better, it was non-existent. He stretched, twisted his torso, and felt the suppleness of a 20-year-old athlete. It defied every law of biology he knew. You don't just heal a chronic back injury overnight at age 58. But then, the house itself began to change. Arthur's home was built in 1922. It was a beautiful craftsman-style house, but like any century-old structure, it had its problems. There was a leak in the basement that 3 different plumbers had failed to fix. The hardwood floors in the dining room were warped from a flood that happened in 1998. And the front door always stuck in the frame because the house had settled over the decades. One afternoon, Arthur went down to the basement to check the leak after a heavy rainstorm. He expected to find the usual puddle and the smell of damp concrete. Instead, the floor was bone dry. He looked up at the copper pipes. The old, corroded soldering points had been replaced with perfect, gleaming welds. These weren't just repairs, they were works of art. The pipes looked better than if they had been installed by a master craftsman. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement air. He hadn't hired anyone, no one had been in his house. He checked the security system, a modern 4-camera setup he'd installed 2 years prior. He scrolled through the footage from the previous night. The cameras showed the basement, the kitchen, and the hallway. At 3:15 in the morning, the footage became grainy, obscured by a strange, static-like interference. But through the haze, Arthur saw a shape. It was a figure, roughly his height and build, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. The figure wasn't doing anything in a traditional sense. It seemed to be vibrating against the walls. Wherever it touched the house, the peeling wallpaper smoothed itself out. Wherever it stepped, the floorboards ceased to creak. Arthur watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, as the figure walked toward the camera. As it got closer, the static cleared for a fraction of a second. The face on the screen was Arthur's face. But it wasn't the Arthur who was currently sitting in his chair with a trembling hand on the mouse. It was a version of Arthur that was perfectly symmetrical. The nose was straighter, the teeth were whiter, the hair was a thick, lustrous silver instead of the thinning, patchy gray Arthur saw in the mirror every day. He shut the computer down and sat in total silence for 1 hour. He should have called the police, he should have run out of the house. But there is a specific kind of curiosity that strikes a man when he sees a perfect version of himself. He felt a strange, seductive pull. This thing wasn't hurting him, it was fixing his world. Over the next 2 weeks, the thing became more bold. Arthur would be sitting in his living room reading, and he would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. He would turn, and for a split second, he would see himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen. But the entity would be standing with perfect posture, wearing the same flannel shirt Arthur was wearing, except the shirt on the entity looked brand new, the colors vibrant, the fabric crisp. Arthur began to notice his own body changing even more rapidly. One morning, he realized he no longer needed his reading glasses. He picked up a book and could see the fine print with microscopic clarity. His hearing sharpened to the point where he could hear the heartbeat of a bird sitting on a branch 50 feet outside his window. His mind, which had felt increasingly foggy over the last few years, was now like a supercomputer. He could hear things no one should hear, see things no one should see, and think faster than his own fear could keep up. He moved without effort, without pain, without hesitation. And that's when he realized something else was moving him. The thing was no longer just a ghost in the house. It was the house. And it was him. It wasn't fixing the house. It was replacing him. On a Tuesday in November, exactly 21 days after the first incident, Arthur decided he had to confront it. He was terrified, yes, but he also felt a deep sense of inadequacy. He felt like an outdated version of something that was being replaced. He stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, sitting in his favorite armchair in the center of the living room. He didn't turn on any lights. He just sat there, waiting. At exactly 3:33 in the morning, the air in the room changed. It became dense, smelling of ozone and fresh-cut grass, the smell of something new and powerful. He heard footsteps coming down the stairs. They weren't his footsteps. His footsteps were heavy, slightly dragging the left heel. These footsteps were rhythmic and light, like a dancer. A figure stepped into the moonlight that was streaming through the window. It was him. It was Arthur. But it was the Arthur that had never suffered a day of stress in his life. This Arthur stood 6 feet tall, having regained the 2 inches of height lost to spinal compression over the years. This Arthur had skin that glowed with vitality. The entity didn't speak. It didn't have to. It walked over to the bookshelf and picked up a wooden clock that had been broken since 1984. It was a family heirloom that Arthur had tried to fix 100 times, but the internal gears were simply too worn out. The entity held the clock in its hands for 3 seconds. A faint humming sound filled the room. When the entity placed the clock back on the shelf, it began to tick. It wasn't just ticking. It was keeping time with a precision that surpassed an atomic clock. Arthur found his voice, though it sounded weak and raspy to his own ears. "What are you?" he whispered. The entity turned to look at him. Its eyes were the same blue as Arthur's, but they were deeper, more vibrant, like looking into the ocean. The entity smiled. It wasn't a malicious smile. It was the smile of a technician looking at a faulty piece of equipment that had finally been repaired. "I am the correction," the entity said. Its voice was Arthur's voice, but without the gravelly edge of age. It was melodic. It was perfect. "Why are you doing this?" Arthur asked, his grip tightening on the arms of his chair. The entity walked closer, stopping just 2 feet away. "The universe is full of errors, Arthur. Friction, decay, entropy. You are a collection of errors. Your house is a collection of errors. I am here to remove the friction." Arthur looked down at his own hands. They were trembling. He noticed that the liver spots on his skin were fading away even as he watched. His fingernails were becoming strong and clear. He should have been happy, but he felt a cold, soul-crushing dread. "What happens to me when the errors are all gone?" Arthur asked. The entity reached out a hand and touched Arthur's forehead. Its skin was neither hot nor cold. It felt like nothing at all, like the absence of temperature. "There is no you and me, Arthur," the entity whispered. "There is only the pattern, and the pattern is being optimized." In that moment, Arthur felt his consciousness begin to expand. He wasn't just in his body anymore. He could feel the electrical wiring in the walls. He could feel the structural integrity of the roof beams. He could feel the roots of the trees in the backyard pushing through the soil. He realized with a jolt of horror that the house wasn't just being fixed, it was being turned into a living organism. A perfect, logical, frictionless organism. And he was the brain. But not the brain he used to be. He was being rewritten. He tried to scream, but no sound came out the way he expected. Instead of a scream, a strange, resonant tone escaped his mouth, vibrating the glass around him. He tried to stand up, but his muscles moved with a pre-programmed efficiency that bypassed his will. He walked to the kitchen, his body moving on its own, and began to organize the silverware with a speed that the human eye could barely follow. He felt disconnected from his own body, as if something else was quietly taking control. Days turned into weeks. Arthur no longer ate. He didn't need to. His body began to change in ways he couldn't fully understand. He no longer slept. He spent the night standing in the center of the living room, his mind processing complex mathematical theorems that redefined the laws of physics. He watched the neighbors through the windows. He saw Mr. Henderson across the street, a man of 65 who struggled with a heavy trash can. Arthur felt a strange, cold impulse. He wanted to go over there. He wanted to fix Mr. Henderson. He wanted to smooth out the wrinkles in the man's face and repair the damaged valves in his heart, but there was a small, flickering part of the old Arthur Miller that remained. It was a tiny spark of imperfection, a small knot of human, messy emotion that refused to be optimized. This part of him remembered Martha. It remembered the way she would laugh when she burned the toast. It remembered the time they got lost in the woods in Maine and had to spend the night in a leaky tent, shivering and miserable, but completely, wonderfully alive. The new Arthur, the entity, wanted to erase those memories. They were noise. They were errors in the data stream of his life. One night, the entity decided it was time for the final optimization. It walked Arthur's body down to the basement. The basement was no longer a basement. It had become a chamber of shifting geometric shapes, the walls pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light. In the center of the room was a chair made of a material that looked like a cross between glass and bone. Arthur felt his body sit down. He felt the thing, the presence that had started this, all merge fully with his consciousness. This was the moment where the last of the noise would be silenced. No, the old Arthur thought, I don't want to be perfect. The entity paused. Perfection is the only logical end state, it replied within his mind. Why would you choose to be slow? Why would you choose to be weak? Why would you choose to die? Because that's what I am, Arthur thought. I am a man who loses his keys. I am a man who misses his wife. I am a man who has a bad back because I worked hard for 40 years. Those aren't errors. Those are the story. The entity let out a sound that wasn't a sound. It was a wave of pure, cold logic that crashed against Arthur's mind. It began to strip away pieces of his past, one by one. Memories started fading, small ones at first, then the ones that mattered most. Arthur fought back. He didn't have the power of a god, but he had the stubbornness of a human being. He clutched onto that memory of the movie theater. He focused on the smell of the popcorn, the sticky floor, and the way Martha's thumb rubbed against his knuckle. He made that memory heavy, he made it loud, he made it as noisy and imperfect as possible. The entity recoiled. It couldn't process the sheer irrational weight of human nostalgia. To the entity, the memory was a virus. It was a jagged piece of code that threatened the entire system. The house began to shake. The perfect, gleaming copper pipes in the basement began to tarnish. The smooth, unblemished walls started to crack. The optimization was being reversed by the sheer force of Arthur's refusal to let go of his flaws. You are destroying the work, the entity hissed, its voice flickering like a dying light bulb. I am taking my house back, Arthur shouted in his mind. He poured every ounce of his humanity into the struggle. He remembered every failure, every mistake, every embarrassing moment, and every physical ache. He embraced the entropy. He called for the decay. He invited the rust and the dust and the gray hair back into his world. There was a blinding flash of white light, followed by a sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once. Arthur collapsed onto the cold, damp concrete floor. He lay there for a long time, gasping for air. His lungs felt heavy. His back hurt. It was a sharp, familiar, wonderful pain. He reached up and touched his face. His skin was rough. He felt the stubble on his chin and the deep lines around his eyes. He looked around the basement. The pulsing lights were gone. The strange glass chair had vanished. The copper pipes were dull and slightly green at the joints. The puddle of water had returned to the corner of the room, leaking slowly from the foundation. He was home. Arthur stood up, his joints popping and complaining with every movement. He climbed the stairs, each one creaking under his weight like a familiar old friend. He walked into the kitchen and saw the coffee machine. It was empty. The counter was covered in a thin layer of dust. He went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. He saw an old man, a tired man, a man who would eventually die just like everyone else. He smiled, and his slightly crooked teeth smiled back. But as he turned to leave the bathroom, he stopped. On the mirror, written in the steam from his own breath, were 4 words. They weren't written by a hand. They seemed to have formed naturally from the moisture, as if the house itself was still trying to communicate. The words said, 9% remaining. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the drafty house. He realized then that he hadn't won, not entirely. He had pushed the entity back, but it hadn't left. It was still there, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very cells of his body, waiting for him to get tired. Waiting for him to have another senior moment, waiting for him to wish, just for a second, that he was a little bit better than he was. Arthur Miller is now 62 years old. If you were to walk past his house in that quiet Connecticut suburb, you would see a perfectly normal home. The lawn is perhaps a little too green, and the paint on the shutters never seems to fade, no matter how harsh the winter is. If you were to see Arthur at the grocery store, you might notice that he moves with a certain fluidity that seems out of place for a man his age. You might notice that he never wears glasses, and that his eyes are a shade of blue so intense, it's almost uncomfortable to look at. But if you get close enough to him, if you stand next to him in the checkout line, you might hear something. It's not a heartbeat. It's a faint, rhythmic ticking sound, like a very old, very precise clock. And if you catch his eye, you will see a man who is terrified to go to sleep. Because Arthur Miller knows that every time he closes his eyes, another 1% of his humanity is optimized away. He knows that one day he will wake up and he won't be Arthur Miller anymore. He will be something perfect. He will be the thing in the house. And then he will start noticing others who need to be fixed. Because after all, the universe is full of errors, and they all need to be corrected. So, if you're sitting in your house right now and you notice that a leaky faucet has suddenly stopped dripping, or that a scratch on your dining room table has mysteriously vanished, don't be happy. Don't be relieved, because it's not a miracle. It's an upgrade, and you might not like the final version. And if your house ever starts fixing things on its own, you might want to leave. And that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this tale of the strange, dark, and mysterious, consider sharing it with someone who loves a good nightmare. Until then, keep an eye on your reflection, because one day it might look back a little too perfectly. Good night. There was a noise in his house, but it wasn't coming from anywhere, so he followed it. Big mistake. Because when he found it, he realized he was already there. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't imagining things. Everything in his life was completely normal until the night he heard a noise that didn't make sense. And once he noticed it, it never stopped. The Man of Routine 2. Understand this story. You need to know who it's about. His name was Arthur Miller. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or overactive imaginations. He was 56 years old, lived in a quiet, tree-lined suburb in eastern Pennsylvania, and worked as a senior actuary for a major insurance firm. If there was anyone in the world who lived their life by the numbers, it was Arthur. He liked his coffee at exactly 6:30 in the morning, his toast slightly burnt, and his evening news at exactly 6 o'clock. Everything in Arthur's world was a calculation. He managed risk for a living, and he applied that same meticulous care to his personal life. Arthur lived alone in a large two-story colonial house that he had purchased with his wife 32 years ago. After she passed away in the spring of 2020, the house felt far too big. Every floorboard that creaked and every shutter that rattled in the wind seemed to echo just a little bit louder than before. But Arthur was a man of habit. He stayed, he kept the lawn manicured, he kept the gutters clean, and he kept his life moving in a straight, predictable line. He didn't believe in ghosts, he didn't believe in the supernatural, and he certainly didn't believe in things that couldn't be explained by a spreadsheet. Or at least, he did until the night of October the 14th, 2025. It was a Tuesday. The weather was that specific kind of Pennsylvania autumn chill, damp, foggy, and biting. Arthur had finished his dinner, which consisted of a single chicken breast and steamed broccoli, washed his single plate and single fork, and was sitting in his leather armchair in the den. He was reading a biography of a long-dead politician, the kind of book that is meant to be read slowly over several months. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. At exactly 10:45, Arthur prepared to head upstairs to bed. He turned off the lamp, stood up, and stretched his back, feeling the familiar ache of a man in his mid-50s. But just as he reached for the light switch by the door, he heard it. Tap, tap, scrape. Arthur froze. He lived in a neighborhood where the most exciting thing that happened was a raccoon getting into a trash can. This didn't sound like a raccoon. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it was coming from inside the wall. It wasn't the frantic scratching of a rodent. It sounded like something solid metal or stone hitting the structure of the house. The first ascent, most people would assume it was mice. Arthur did too. He sighed. He'd deal with it in the morning. He flipped the switch, plunging the den into darkness, and started toward the stairs. Tap, tap, scrape. He stopped again. This time, the sound was louder. It wasn't coming from the den walls anymore. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen. Arthur walked back through the darkened hallway, his slippers padding softly on the hardwood. He entered the kitchen and stood perfectly still. The refrigerator hummed. The digital clock on the oven glowed green, showing 10:48. The house was silent for 10 seconds. Then, from directly beneath his feet, beneath the linoleum floor, came the sound again. Tap, tap, scrape. Arthur frowned. Beneath the kitchen was the basement. Now, the basement of Arthur's house was a place he rarely visited unless it was absolutely necessary. It was a cold, unfinished space where he kept his water heater, his furnace, and about 40 boxes of things he hadn't looked at since the late 90s. It was a graveyard for old memories, tax returns from 1998, holiday decorations from 2005, and his late wife's collection of antique ceramics. He opened the basement door. A draft of cold, metallic-smelling air drifted up to meet him. He reached for the string of the overhead light, pulled it, and the single bulb flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the concrete floor. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended. Arthur's mind was already running through the logistics. Was a pipe loose? Was the furnace malfunctioning? He reached the bottom and looked around. The water heater was humming quietly. The furnace was dormant. Everything looked exactly as it should. He waited for 5 minutes, standing there in the cold, feeling a bit ridiculous. Just the pipe settling, he whispered to himself. But as he turned to head back upstairs, the sound returned. Only this time, it wasn't a tap or a scrape. It was a voice. It was faint, so faint that he almost thought he'd imagined it, but it was definitely a human voice. It sounded muffled, as if someone were speaking through a heavy thicket of blankets or from behind a thick concrete barrier. And it was coming from the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old corrugated boxes that hadn't been moved in 20 years. The impossible space Arthur's heart began to beat a little faster. He wasn't a brave man, but he was a logical one. There was no one in this house but him. He had locked the front door, the back door, and all the windows. There were no windows in the basement large enough for a person to crawl through. The only way in was the door he had just come through. "Hello?" Arthur called out. His voice sounded thin and brittle in the damp air. The voice stopped. For a moment, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then a response came. It wasn't a word, it was a whistle. A short, 3-note whistle that Arthur recognized instantly. It was the exact melody he used to whistle when he was working in the garden, a little tune his wife used to call Arthur's hum. It was a personal, private sound. Arthur felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He walked toward the corner, his hand trembling slightly. He began to move the boxes. These were heavy boxes filled with old tax records from 1998 and 2002. He pushed them aside, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until he reached the very back wall of the basement. The wall was made of solid concrete blocks. It should have been the end of the house. According to the blueprints Arthur had studied when he bought the place in 1993, there was nothing beyond this wall but 6 feet of Pennsylvania dirt and the foundation of his neighbor's yard. But as Arthur moved the final box, he realized the logic of his world was about to break. There, set into the concrete wall where no opening should exist, was a door. It wasn't a modern door. It was made of heavy, dark oak with a brass handle that looked like it belonged in a Victorian-era house. It was perfectly clean, free of dust or cobwebs, looking as though it had been polished that very afternoon. It was completely out of place, tucked away behind boxes of old documents in a basement that hadn't seen a guest in years. Arthur stared at it for what felt like an hour. His mind was racing, trying to find a reason for this door to be here. Maybe the previous owners had built a secret room? No. He had renovated parts of the basement in 2012. He knew what was behind that wall, or he thought he did. Slowly, Arthur reached out and grasped the brass handle. It was warm to the touch. Not just room temperature warm, like a person had just been holding it for several minutes. He turned the handle. It moved with a silent, well-oiled precision. He pushed the door open. The second house Arthur expected to see a small crawl space, a forgotten wine cellar, or perhaps even just a wall of dirt that someone had built a fake door against as a joke. Instead, when the door swung wide, he found himself looking into a hallway, but it wasn't just any hallway. Arthur gasped, his knees nearly giving out, and he had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The hallway on the other side of that basement door was identical to the hallway on his first floor. It wasn't just similar, it was a perfect carbon copy. The same mahogany wainscoting, the same patterned wallpaper with the tiny gold fleur-de-lis that he and his wife had picked out in 2008. The same Persian rug that had a small, faint wine stain on the left corner from a New Year's Eve party in 2015, Arthur stepped through the doorway. As soon as his feet hit the carpet, the sound of the basement, the hum of the water heater, the drip of the pipes, the smell of damp concrete vanished instantly. It was replaced by a silence so absolute it made his ears ring. It was the silence of a house that is lived in but currently empty. He turned around to look back at the basement, but the door he had just walked through was no longer there. In its place was his own front door, complete with the heavy deadbolt, the brass knocker, and the small circular peephole. Arthur was standing in his own foyer. Or, at least, a perfect replica of it. He checked the time on his watch. It was 10:55. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, expecting to see his street. But the glass was black. Not just nighttime black, but a void. There were no streetlights, no stars, no reflections of his neighbor's house. Just a flat, matte blackness that seemed to absorb the light from the foyer lamp. "Is someone there?" he shouted. His voice didn't echo. It felt flat, swallowed by the walls. He began to walk through this version of his house. Everything was perfect. He went into the kitchen. On the counter sat a single plate and a single fork, freshly washed and drying in the rack. He went into the den. His biography of the politician lay open on the leather armchair exactly where he had left it 10 minutes ago. He even saw his reading glasses resting on the side table. It was as if he had stepped into a mirror, but something was fundamentally off. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm charged with a static that made his skin crawl. And there was a smell, a faint, sickly sweet scent, like lilies left too long in a vase or old perfume that had gone sour. Then he heard the noise again. Tap, tap. Scrape. It was coming from upstairs, from his bedroom. The man in the bedroom, Arthur, reached the base of the stairs. He felt a sense of profound dread, the kind of primal fear that tells an animal to run, to hide, to get away from a predator. But Arthur was an actuary. His whole life was built on understanding the why of things. He needed to find the source. He needed to see if he was losing his mind or if the universe had simply decided to stop making sense. He climbed the stairs one by one. 1, 2, 3. He counted them, just as he always did when he was stressed. By the time he reached the 13th step, he could see the light spilling out from under his bedroom door. It was the yellow glow of the bedside lamps, the ones with the cream-colored shades his wife had bought at an estate sale in 2012. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the landing and walked toward the door. The tapping sound was constant now. It was rhythmic, steady, and incredibly loud in the silence of the house. Tap, tap, scrape. Arthur reached for the doorknob. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second, and shoved the door open. The room was bathed in that familiar, warm glow. Everything was in its place. The bed was neatly made with the blue duvet. The curtains were drawn tight. But there, standing at the far end of the room, with his back to the door, was a man. The man was wearing a navy blue bathrobe, the exact same bathrobe Arthur had received as a gift for his 55th birthday from his sister. The man was the same height as Arthur. He had the same thinning gray hair. He had the same slight slouch in his shoulders from years of sitting at a desk. The man was standing in front of the vanity mirror, but he wasn't looking at himself. He was leaning forward, his forehead pressed against the cold glass. He was holding a small, metallic object in his right hand, and he was rhythmically tapping it against the mirror. Tap, tap, scrape. Arthur's voice was a whisper, barely more than a breath. Who are you? The man stopped tapping. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow, heavy breath that sounded wet and labored. I followed the noise, the man said. Arthur's blood ran cold. The voice was his. Not just a similar voice, not an imitation, but the exact frequency, the exact cadence, and the exact mid-Atlantic accent of his own speech. It was like hearing a high-fidelity recording of himself played back in real time. What do you mean? Arthur asked, his voice cracking with terror. The man began to turn, slowly, deliberately, as if his joints were rusted and moving them caused him immense pain. I was sitting in my den, the man said, his back still partially to Arthur. I was reading my book. It was 10:45 at night, and I heard a sound in my wall, a tap, a scrape. I thought it was a mouse. I thought it was the pipes, but it kept moving. It led me to the basement. The man turned fully now. Arthur looked into the man's face, and he felt a scream die in his throat. It was him. It was Arthur Miller. But it wasn't the Arthur Miller who had lived a quiet life of insurance and routine. This version of Arthur had eyes that were wide and bloodshot, fixed in a permanent stare of absolute, soul-shattering terror. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if he hadn't seen the sun in decades. There were deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face that Arthur didn't have, and in his hand he wasn't holding a tool or a piece of jewelry. He was holding a jagged piece of concrete, a piece of the foundation wall from the basement. I followed the noise, the other Arthur repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. I went into the basement, I found a door behind the boxes, I walked through it, and I found myself standing here, in this room, waiting for the door to open. The logic of the loop, Arthur backed away, his hands up in a defensive gesture, his mind screaming that this was impossible. This isn't real. This is a dream. I'm having a stroke. I'm in a hospital bed somewhere, and this is a hallucination. There is no door in the basement. There is only one me. The other Arthur stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. That's what I said, the first time, or was it the 52nd time? I've lost track of the years, Arthur, or the minutes. They feel the same here. Time doesn't work the same way when you're outside the lines. Where is here? Arthur cried out, his back hitting the bedroom door, which was now closed and locked. The other man gestured to the room around them. It's the house, but it's the house that never ends. You think you're in your bedroom? You think you're in Pennsylvania? Go look out the window again, Arthur. Look closer this time. Arthur scrambled to the window and tore open the heavy curtains. He expected to see the black void he had seen in the foyer. But now that he was on the second floor, the perspective had changed. He saw windows, thousands of them. Across a narrow, impossible chasm of perhaps 10 feet, there was another house. It was a colonial-style house, identical to his. And beyond that, another, and another. They were stacked like bricks in a wall that stretched infinitely in every direction. They extended upward into an infinite black sky where no stars existed, and they plunged downward into a bottomless pit. In every single window he could see, there was a man. Some were sitting in armchairs, some were standing in kitchens, but in most of the windows, there was a man in a navy blue bathrobe standing at the glass, looking back at him. Thousands of Arthur Millers, all of them trapped in a grid of houses that defied the geometry of the universe. It was a hive of identical lives, a cosmic filing cabinet where every drawer was the same. The noise, the other Arthur whispered, now standing just inches away. Arthur could smell the stale breath and the scent of old lilies. The noise is how we find each other. We follow it, hoping it leads to an exit. Hoping that this time the door in the basement leads to the real world, but it only leads to the next room, to the next version of us. We are the signal and the receiver, Arthur. We are the tapping in the walls. Arthur felt a wave of vertigo so strong he had to grab the edge of the dresser to keep from falling. His logical mind was trying to find a solution, a way to calculate the risk, a way to insure against this, but there was no math for this. There was no actuarial table for eternity. How do I get back? Arthur begged. I have to go back to my house, my wife. She's gone, but her things are there. My life is there. The other Arthur smiled, and it was an expression of such profound pity that it was harder to look at than the tired eyes. This is your house. You've always been here. You just finally followed the noise long enough to notice the walls. You thought your life was a straight line? It's a circle, Arthur. A very, very small circle. The other man then did something terrifying. He reached out and touched Arthur's chest. His hand was cold, ice cold, like the air in the basement that never sees the sun. It's your turn now, the man said. My turn for what? To make the noise. Before Arthur could react, the other man simply vanished. He didn't run, he didn't fade, he simply ceased to occupy the space. One moment he was a solid, breathing person, and the next, the space he occupied was empty. The room felt lighter, the static in the air dissipated, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The tapping starts again. Arthur stood in the silent bedroom for a long time. He ran to the door and pulled at the handle, but when he opened it, it didn't lead to the hallway, it led back into the same bedroom. He tried the closet, he opened the door and stepped in, only to walk out of the same closet door back into the bedroom. He tried the window. He climbed out onto the ledge, heart racing, and jumped across the small gap to the window of the house opposite him. He crashed through the glass, landing on the carpet, only to look up and realize he was back in his own bedroom. The logic of the world had completely collapsed. There was no outside. There was no Pennsylvania. There was only the interior of a 56-year-old man's life, repeated forever. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed. He cried until he had no more tears. He screamed until he couldn't anymore, until all that came out was a raspy, broken sound. Eventually, the silence became too much. The silence in that room was heavier than the fear. It was a crushing, physical weight that pressed against his eardrums, making his head throb. He needed to hear something. Anything to prove he still existed. He looked down at the floor. There, lying on the carpet where the other man had been standing, was the jagged piece of concrete. Arthur picked it up. It felt heavy and real. It was the only thing in the room that felt like it came from the world he remembered. He walked over to the vanity mirror. He looked at his own reflection. He looked older now. His hair was messier, his eyes more sunken. He looked like the man he had just met. He raised the stone. He didn't want to do it. Every fiber of his being told him to stop. But the silence was screaming. Tap. He waited. His heart skipped a beat. Tap. He scraped the stone against the glass, creating a harsh, grating sound that vibrated through his teeth. Scrape. Downstairs, in a version of the house that felt a million miles away, but was only a door-length distant, a man was sitting in a leather armchair. That man was an actuary. He was 56 years old. He was reading a biography of a long-dead politician. It was 10:45 on a Tuesday night in October, and that man just froze. He looked toward the ceiling, his heart beginning to race. He heard a sound, a rhythmic, deliberate sound coming from the walls, a sound that shouldn't be there. Arthur Miller, standing in the infinite bedroom, heard a door open far below him. He heard the faint, heavy footsteps of a man in slippers. He heard the basement door creak on its hinges. He heard the sound of boxes being moved, heavy boxes filled with tax returns from 1998. Arthur leaned his forehead against the mirror and closed his eyes. He didn't want to be the monster in the room. He didn't want to be the mystery, but the rules of this place were absolute. The noise had to be followed. It had to be made so that the next one could find the door. I'm sorry, Arthur whispered to the empty room, his voice a perfect match for the one he had heard earlier. He raised the stone again, his arm moving as if by a clockwork mechanism he couldn't control. Tap, tap, scrape. And somewhere in the dark, another Arthur Miller began his descent into the basement, looking for a door that should not exist, following a noise that would eventually lead him to the most terrifying thing a person can ever encounter: the realization that they are exactly where they are supposed to be forever. If you found this story about the impossible loop of Arthur Miller interesting, please remember that sometimes the noises we hear in the night aren't just the house settling. Sometimes it's just you trying to tell yourself that you're still there. Until next time.